So we are going to lead you now to a panel on complex systems and governance.
So I was asked to, can you hear me? Everything, Carlos? Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
Loud.
Carlos wants to talk about the reasons. You'll talk about things. Maybe I will start.
Sure.
The 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 crisis that we're facing now is is a is a disease crisis, but it's surely also a governmental crisis, and we are seeing that there are actions or opportunities for actions that are not being taken that would be much wiser than the actions that are being taken. And in January, I began, to warn about what was happening in China and telling people that there was an opportunity to prevent it from reaching the West. Unfortunately, that was not done. And the reasons that it was not done at the time had to do with costs. It would cost something, right? You would have to stop flights. That's an economic cost. Now, of course, it looks like that cost is tiny because the economic disruption that's happened since then is huge. Every stage of the way, there's been a decision about what to do and what not to do that somehow has been anchored in a lot of it in economic reasons. And this is totally a misunderstanding of what's going on. A pandemic, destruction by a pandemic, is human and economic, and they're both the same because the amount that it affects is really driven by the number of cases that we have. And the human cost is terrible. The economic cost that people point to can be terrible or can be nothing if we stop it. But the real challenge has been the decision making that has been going on that has not been maybe what surely could have been done to avoid this entirely. Having said that, we are still at a place of decision, and we are in some ways at a crucial tipping point in terms of what the decisions that are being made. And this will affect the discussion of what happens in the post-COVID era, because really the decisions that are being made now will determine whether the world recovers from it in a complete way, and or whether parts of the world will be COVID-free and parts of the world will not. There will definitely be a choice by countries and regions whether they will be winners in this context and will end up without the disease, or whether they will be in a kind of hell that has this disease circulating in the population. And just to be clear about that hell, there are a lot of people who somehow are confused about how bad this disease is. But it's surely not true about people who are in hospitals that are treating patients. The ICU doctors, the people who treat the worst patients under normal circumstances, are also treating these patients. And they're reporting that these are terribly, terribly sick people. And it's not just elderly, it's everyone, young people and old people. There's huge suffering that is going on, and we don't see it because we have a policy of not showing what's happening in hospitals. And that's the people that are hospitalized are 20% of cases with this disease. And the fatality rate has gone up recently in terms of our understanding. We used to say 2 to 4%. Now it's very clear that it's about 5% of cases. And we haven't really been able to make a dent in that number. It's a terrible disease. The other thing that we have to know is that it's very fast, which is that every week, if you don't do something, it's a multiplier by 10 in terms of number of cases. And we can see that very clearly if you look at what happened in Greece and Spain, right, that are on both sides of Italy, which was the conduit of the disease into Europe. Greece acted 2 weeks earlier than Spain, and the trajectory of the disease is 100 times larger in Spain than it is in Greece. Just look it up. So Greece is a winner. They're almost done with the disease. And there are a number of other countries like Austria and Australia and New Zealand, and of course China and South Korea and Iceland that have defeated the disease, and they are winners in this context. But there are other countries that are still struggling, and there are some countries that are even debating about whether to do the fight or not, and that's going to be a hell that will be unfortunate. And I hope people will eventually come to their senses, and hopefully quickly. What's happening is that most countries that are encountering the disease, they're working very hard to compress this factor of 10 to a factor of 1. And the point is that you can go a little bit farther to 0.95, and then you get rid of the disease very quickly. And in fact, it only takes about 5 weeks, because you have an incubation period of 2 weeks where you know who's sick, and then another incubation period that you have to let you've slowed the disease down, so a number of cases are going down dramatically. And then there's a cleanup process if you've missed a few cases. So about 5 weeks is actually enough to stop the disease. And when people talk about economic impacts and all this stuff, even the previous speaker says there's this big effect economically. And the answer is, if it happens for 5 weeks, it's okay. It's only 5 weeks. And then you can go back to normal. So the challenge that we're facing now in terms of understanding the post-COVID world, the first order question is, where will the disease be and where won't it be? I have a few more comments, but Carlos, please talk.
Yes, thank you. Many people are asking, when will we get back to normal? And I don't think we will ever get back to normal. Let's say the normal we used to have. Things are changing too much, not only economically and socially. Everything is changing, and it won't go back to the way it was. So the question is, can we take this opportunity for change to improve many things that we were unable to change? Like, for example, will now governments listen more to scientists or not? We have examples of countries who did that, and now, as Yaneer was mentioning, they're winners, and countries who didn't do that, and they're still suffering, and they will continue suffering. Why so many countries have made such wrong decisions? And I think it has to do precisely with complexity. And this I learned from Yaneer more than 10 years ago. And it has to do with the cybernetic principle. It's called Ashby's law of requisite variety, and it simply states that a control system, in order to be effective, needs to have more variety than that which is trying to control. And you can understand variety as simply as the number of states a system has. So if you want to control, let's say, some factory situation with some automated control, that automated control needs to be able to distinguish all the possible states that the factory can be in. Otherwise, you cannot make the right decisions. And the thing is that this variety is analogous to complexity. More complexity you have, the more situations that you have. And the variety of politicians and governments is limited, in the sense that we are unable to cope with the high complexity of our modern societies. And we have seen this in recent years with bad decisions that different governments have been taking, not only related to healthcare, but financial crises, let's say political crises. And you can see that people are unable to make the right decisions, and not because they're stupid or ill-willed necessarily, simply because of our limited variety. We are unable to cope with the great complexity. So an alternative to that is to use technology to increase the complexity, not of individuals, which is limited, but of social systems. Because many people have argued, well, thanks to Brexit and the current crisis and Trump's election and many other situations, it's a sign that democracy is it's failing. It's already outdated. But the thing is that it's the best game in town. An autocracy, it's even worse, because you have few groups of a small group of people making decisions, and then everyone wants to follow those decisions. And that's even worse than the democracies we have now. But I think we need to move in the opposite direction towards, I don't know whether to call it hyper democracy, where citizen participation is much more active and much more involved, because simply being able to respond to what different people perceive and feel and know, governments will be able to make much better decisions. Just that in most countries we don't have the mechanisms to channel that information and take decisions at the appropriate speed. So you can see that many countries like France or the UK, Mexico, the reporting of COVID-19, they're not daily. Some of the numbers are updated 1 week later. In UK and France, they haven't reported how many cases have recovered yet. So let's say we don't know how many active cases they have. So that's a problem that many governments had. So probably this situation will be enough an excuse to update those different mechanisms and different systems to have real-time information, real-time decision, and mechanisms also for real-time action in order to cope with increasing complexity of our societies.
Yeah.
Do you want to add something, Yaneer?
I'll just add a little bit, and I think that you've said something extremely important, that we really have to find out how we can collaborate together, because everybody, this is like, the movies that are made with superheroes, right? Everybody has a superpower. And if we combine our individual talents together in a complementary way, we can do tremendous things. And going back to this, the business about which countries listened to scientists and which didn't, unfortunately, it hasn't been that simple. And a lot of the epidemiologists are experts in flu, and flu goes around and around in the society. And so they're framing the response to the outbreak in terms of flu. It's got to be like flu because that's what they study. And the answer is no. And, I've worked on Ebola outbreaks, and I've worked on, we study outbreaks and the devastation that they cause, and we know that we can stop things. And that's a different strategy. It's a strategy that involves human action and decisions about what to do, rather than being a spectator and watching what happens. And it's a very different approach. And it's not that the flu people are wrong. It's just that they're right about flu and about diseases like flu, and not about diseases like the coronavirus and like Ebola. So part of the strategy is to combine our talents. They should not be advising about coronavirus, and I don't have any reason to advise about flu. And this is how we need to develop an understanding. But ultimately, combining our talents in a more sophisticated way is where we need to go.
And I guess also with the transition that we will have in the next few months, people are starting to ask the philosophical question of, okay, what matters more, our individual freedoms or human lives? Because let's say countries that have managed to control their own epidemics, you could say that they have restricted more the individual freedoms. And then some people who are, let's say, throughout history, many people have given their lives to fight for freedom. But I think it's different levels of freedom that you can have. And I think that we don't have absolute freedom. So it's also a bit difficult to compare, like, let's say, staying at home is not the same as slavery, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's important. I also think it's really important to realize that it's about time.
Yes.
How much time?
And,
we can hold our breath for a certain amount of time, and we can stay at home for a few weeks.
And indeed, it's a sacrifice to sacrifice our individual freedoms, but in order to regain them in the shortest time possible. Because countries that did not have stay-at-home orders, they had to implement it anyway, like Sweden, and for longer and with harder impact. So let's say, that argument is not very valid.
Yeah, I think that part of the problem is that when one is ideologically responding, say, no, we can't do that, you don't ask the question of what are the consequences. And I think what science is responsible in the context of policy is to clearly articulate what are the consequences of choices. and not speculate about, you know, mathematical assumptions or assumptions about what might happen and so on. It's really about the specific consequences of the actions that we understand, and to make that clear to policymakers. And unfortunately, that hasn't been very well done.
Yeah. And I guess also many of the bad decisions which have been made are also because of a lack of, let's call it, complexity literacy. I mean, this assumption that there's a single cause for a single, with a single effect. And then, let's say, since this is a very complex situation where we have many causes with many effects entwined, it is clear that we cannot solve the situation, we cannot beat the pandemics with a single action. So some countries, they say, okay, we will do this and this, but it's not enough. You need to do also this and this and this.
Right.
So that's the case in Mexico. The government has implemented some measures, but not everything, so that it's successfully eradicated. So we're still struggling, and we will struggle at least for a month.
So maybe we should go to questions, since I think we've it's about time for questions. Are there questions?
Hi. So let's look at some of the questions. I'm hearing a lot of questions about the comparison to Sweden towards other countries that use lockdown and stay-in-place orders, and seeing this relative success.
So Sweden, you know, they didn't do stuff, but it seems that the people don't want to get the disease. So anyway, they're doing stuff themselves, which makes sense. And one of the things that we've seen over and over again is that when governments fail to act, right, the grassroots is acting, and it's a harder, right, because it's a really all-in kind of thing. So if the people are doing it, and the government is doing it, and the companies are doing it, the community organizations are doing it, then, you know, you're there, and you push hard, you get it done, and you're done, and that's the best. And when you have parts of the society that are working against each other, so the government may not be doing it, the people have to do it, or the government is doing it and the people are not doing it, then at last it drags and drags and drags and drags. So that's the kind of thing that we're seeing in Sweden and everywhere else.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a lot of mistrust from. Actually, Carlos, sorry, you were going to talk.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Let's say another example is that of Brazil, that the president has been against any restraint. He says that Brazil shouldn't stop, their economy shouldn't stop. Then the governors have had to let's say make their own decisions. Let's say a bit like in the United States, but even more extreme. So in some neighborhoods in Rio de Janeiro, even the organized crime had to take actions. So they were putting signs like, okay, if you go outside after 8 p.m., we will teach you how to respect your neighbor. So as Yaneer said, someone has to take responsibility, and then I guess once the dead people start accumulating, someone will take action. If it's not the government, it will be society or businesses or governors, local governments.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's taken seeing that it has huge impact everywhere. Almost everywhere. There are a few places that realize that they could trust what happens someplace else and prevent it from getting there, like again in Greece, the countries that I mentioned earlier. But a lot of it has been, hey, until I see it smack in the face, I'm not going to do anything about it. And I don't know, when you're in a competition with something that's a terrible thing, why would you wait until you give it the first hit? It just doesn't make any sense.
Yep.
What's the next question?
We have, how can we use complex network thinking to organize economies? For example, Monitor Institute talked about connection science. What are the fields that will surface after, I assume, after COVID-19?
Right. So network science is part of the overall field of complexity sciences, or science. And the basic idea of the complexity science is that the traditional math that we used to use, statistics and calculus, are not enough to describe the world. And depending upon the way in which they don't describe the world, we need different kinds of tools. One of them is networks, one is nonlinear dynamics, one is agent-based modeling, another one is stochastic dynamical processes, and then there's spatial models and all kinds of things. So these are like tools. It's like having a set of power tools. So it's not science, one science or other science. So people like to call everything its own field, but these are really different tools. And when we face real world problems, we need a set of tools, like building a building. You don't build a building using a saw. You have a whole set of tools, and that's really what these are about. Carlos, you want to add?
Yeah, related to economies, it's essential to understand complexity and to have a thinking, let's say a systemic thinking, because let's say economies are becoming more and more complex because there are more and more components and more connections between them, and they're changing faster. So your planning is limited, your prediction is limited. So you need to take different approaches on how to let's say to plan. I mean, yeah, you need to plan somehow, but let's say since complexity limits prediction, because you have interactions that generate novel information, you need to build adaptive and robust or anti-fragile mechanisms. So an economy that's at the same time resistant to change and benefits from change or adapts to change will do much better than one that is fragile to change. And this will happen either by natural selection, meaning that the ones which do not have these properties will go bankrupt, or by design if we use our understanding of complexity and start designing economies and companies and global trade networks in such a way that small failure does not propagate globally.
We have here a very interesting question from Mark Fraser. If simple rules generate complex behavior, what are the simple rules you would recommend for startup societies?
So it is important to understand that the idea that simple rules generate complex behaviors has to do with a certain way of thinking that has to do with universality. What it means is that there's a whole bunch of systems that have the same behavior, and that we can pick among them the ones that have simple rules. But that class of systems, the behavior that they share is only a large scale behavior, not the whole behavior of the system. So there's a misunderstanding that dates back to sort of early in sort of the study of complex systems, where people realized that you could create simple collective behaviors using simple rules, not that you can create complex societies with simple rules. So I do want to make that clear. At the same time, the purpose of understanding the relationship between simple rules and collective behaviors is really to enable us to understand what the essential behaviors are that create these collective behaviors. And again, it's not so. So, for example, if we see that societies, many societies are all making a decision either to go all out and stop the disease or not to go all out, we see that there are some rules that are taking place in the society, like how they think about trade-offs in economics and life and so on, that are clearly playing a role, not in one place, but in many places, because these societies are not the same. So if they're doing the same collective behavior, there's likely to be a simple behavior that underlies them. But when we talk about the rules that create effective societies that Carlos has been talking about, those are exactly the things that cannot be described by simple rules, because they're inherently complex in the sense of Ashby's law. And you cannot make something complex in the sense of Ashby's law using simple rules. It would be a mathematical contradiction.
Yes, I mean, for example, Donella Meadows has made this popular this idea of acupuncture points, that with a small measure you can cause big changes, and in very few cases you can do that. I mean, for example, we did something like that to organize public transport in Mexico City, that basically you paint lines where the doors will stand, and then people started queuing instead of pushing to board and descent as it used to be. But in many cases, you would like to have such simple rules, such mediators that would regulate interactions, because at the end you cannot change the components of many complex systems. We cannot change politicians. We can only try to change how they interact and how they behave. But as Yaneer was mentioning, in many cases, you cannot come up with a simple rule precisely because of Ashby's law of requisite variety. If there are too many situations that are particular and they change depending on the details, then you need to address each of those situations in particular, and that won't be simple. So it's context dependent, and even when there are some ideas that you can generalize studying complex systems, the solutions not necessarily are straightforward applications of a general methodology or a recipe. So that's also a challenge we're facing as opposed to traditional science, where say you can have a methodology and then you just follow that methodology and you will find a solution. With complex systems, you need to develop ad hoc mechanisms for each problem that you are facing. Of course, there are general principles which give you ideas and direction, but it's not ready-made solutions. So that's also a challenge we'll be facing.
Yeah.
And since we have time for one more question, now that you mentioned Ashby and the law of requisite variety, Francisco Contreras is asking, does the management of complexity necessarily requires decentralized governance? This is especially relevant with the current pandemic, where the trend tends to be towards more centralization instead of less. Is the pandemic a type of complexity that calls for centralization?
So really, the pandemic is not a highly complex problem. It's a large scale problem, right? So it's a challenge to the entire society all at once. And so it really does benefit from large scale response. That doesn't mean that there aren't fine scale and localized efforts that are needed, grassroots efforts that are needed in order to defeat it, because it's really transmission is in the community. So the community and the individuals have to choose to make the disease go away. So it's a collaboration, but it is an interaction between the large scale and the fine scale. So it's not just about decentralization. And in general, if we understand complex systems well, we realize that any system that is a system has to have behaviors in multiple scales. And when we respond to challenges as individuals, right, we have this amazing combination of an immune system that is very decentralized but has centralized parts like nodes. And we have a nervous system that has the ability to act, but it requires a centralized processing, but it's a decentralized decision making through the nervous system. So there's this interplay of these different components that have these combinations of centralization and decentralization. So it's not just one thing, but decentralization in compared to an autocracy is surely needed to deal with complexity. So there's all of these parts. And in the case of a pandemic, it draws on these aspects in a particular way. I do want to say something, though, in terms of decentralization and its role in this context. A couple of months ago, when people were not doing the right decisions, I invited volunteers to help me. And there's a huge volunteer community on endcoronavirus.org. It's the website that was built in order to fight this outbreak, and it's in the chat. I invite everyone who would like to participate to join us in this effort. And it is a tremendous battle to defeat a horrendous enemy. And I would appreciate, and I'm sure everyone would appreciate, that we will work on it together. Whether you share with us, the effort on in the community that we built or otherwise, if you can galvanize your community, your friends and family, neighbors, if you can talk to policymakers at any level of government, industry, religious organizations, and help to end this terrible disease. Thank you.
And I would also just like to add, related to decentralization versus centralization, it depends on the problem. So some problems are better managed from a centralized perspective and some aren't. So it's difficult to say, okay, this is the solution and let's decentralize everything, because in some situations it doesn't work as well as a centralized solution. So actually, if you have no idea which kind of problem you'll face, the ideal organization should be able to switch between centralized and distributed and self-organizing. And in a way, we have such structure in our society, let's say with informal organizations, but let's say it could be better managed and better organized. And hopefully we will use the lessons from the pandemics to better organize different responses so that they occur precisely as Yaneer was mentioning, at the scale at which they're required. Since problems occur at different scales, we need responses at different scales.
So I think we're coming to the end. So I want to thank Startup Societies for inviting us. And Carlos, it's been great to be on a panel with you. Appreciate
Yep,
your.
I can say the same.